Hello, so today starting a new topic which is all about disease. So starting with organisms that cause disease, but the topic is just about mostly communicable diseases. So, sorry, not corona, promise. So I think the first thing I kind of actually would encourage you to do, even though it's not a normal lesson, is to actually stop and think, how many diseases can you list now without looking at your phones, Googling it, looking in books, just based on what you know. How many diseases can you list? Once you've done that, you can think about splitting those lists into two different categories. Number one, are they communicable diseases or are they non-communicable diseases? And number two, can they affect just humans and animals, or plants? Okay, so pause maybe now and just kind of try and do that and see what you come up with. Okay, this is what I've come up with for some communicable disease. And remember, a communicable disease is an infectious disease, so a disease that can spread between organisms. So I'm going to read through them really quickly. Malaria, HIV, influenza, herpes, impetigo, rose black spot, Ebola, Zika virus, hepatitis, COVID-19 of course, measles, tuberculosis or TB, polio, HPV, which stands for the human papillomavirus, Lyme disease, typhoid fever, athlete's foot, ringworm, and MRSA, which stands for methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. All communicable diseases, all caused by a range of different things and different types of pathogens. And we'll think about exactly what causes them later. Non-communicable diseases, so a disease that can't be passed between organisms. Now, I'm just mentioning this now to give the distinctions. So things you can't catch, basically. There are obviously far more than my list of 4. I'm just putting 4 down based on the fact that to give you some examples. So CVD, cardiovascular disease, any type of cancer, DVT, deep vein thrombosis, which is like blood clots in the veins in your legs, and asbestosis. Asbestosis I've put on there as an interesting one because some people think it's communicable because they feel like you can catch it from asbestos, whereas that's not quite true. It's a bit like smoking. Smoking's a risk factor to getting certain disease, and asbestos exposure is a risk factor. If anyone is interested in asbestosis, let me know, because I used to work for an asbestos surveying company actually, and I tend to know quite a lot about that and how it kind of, the risks of it, etc. Anyway, so thinking about pathogens. So pathogens are something, an organism that can cause disease. Now we need to be really clear that pathogens tend to be microorganisms, but not all microorganisms are pathogens. Okay, so we know that there are some good microorganisms like the probiotics we get in our guts, the bacteria that live there, that's good. There's a lot of fungus as well that we get that we can actually eat. So people think that those kind of groups, kingdoms, etc., just cause disease. They do not. A pathogen is very simply an organism that causes disease. Because of this, they live in the host's body. There can be many different types of organisms, including protist, or as we're now going to call it, protoctista, fungus, bacteria, or virus. They basically are there to take nutrients from the host, and they have a parasitic relationship. This means that the host directly disadvantages and the pathogen advantages. Okay, different from symbiotic, where one gains and one neither gains or loses. So just to run you through some of them in a bit more detail. So bacteria, we should know, is in the prokaryotic kingdom. It is not all pathogenic. Like I said, you can talk about your gut bacteria there. They are smaller than eukaryotic cells by quite a lot. They reproduce rapidly and much, much faster. And they live around the host cells. Now that's really important. They don't actually enter the cells, they live in the tissues in between your cells, and that's quite important for later on in this topic when we think about why we have to kill bacteria in different ways to things like viruses. 2 examples on the screen right now is TB, tuberculosis. Obviously that is an electron-microgram of that, so it's very zoomed in, it's a rod-shaped bacteria. And another one which is ring rot, which we can see in a potato, again much further zoomed out. Obviously viruses we know very well at the moment, particularly with what's going on in the world. It's actually quite a nice time to be doing this topic, in fact, because we could be doing some extra research maybe on COVID-19. So they actually invade the host cells. So this is different from bacteria. They don't live around the cells, they go into the cells, and that is what makes them hard to kill. In particular, they do enter the nucleus because they tend to interact with our DNA. Good example of that is HIV, human immunodeficiency virus. It inserts its part of its genome into ours so that we reproduce its genes rather than some of our own, and that affects our immune system and makes us immunodeficient. It can cause, once it's kind of dealt with it and it's reproduced, it can cause the host cell to burst, releasing more and more of that virus, and then therefore that enters more and more cells, so on and so forth. A viral disease in a plant that you might actually recognise from GCSE, tobacco mosaic virus, gets its name because number one, it has a mosaic-like pattern and it can infect other plants other than the tobacco plant, but that is where it predominantly infects. Fungal diseases, now in humans, much less deadly, but most of the time are deadly in plants. Come from the kingdom fungi. As I said earlier, not all funguses are pathogenic. We can think about yeast, we can think about mushrooms that we can eat. They tend to live for us in the skin, so we can think about ringworm, for example, athlete's foot, and in vascular tissues of plants, so we're talking about xylem and phloem there. They have things called hyphae. Now the hyphae are like outwards projections and they form what is called mycelium. Okay, now they grow under the surface and they are like the reproductive part. So essentially the hyphae will extend, the mycelium will be on the end, and then they'll break off and that'll be like a new part of the fungus. When they are reproducing, that's what makes things red and irritated and disgusting story, but you know how I love my personal stories. I've had athlete's foot almost as bad as that. It just didn't quite spread as far, but when I was younger I had the most disgusting looking toe and I just didn't know what was wrong with it, but it was athlete's foot and it did look that bad. If anyone's ever had athlete's foot, you tend to get it classically from like damp, sweaty environments. So if you wear a lot of shoes without socks in the summer, more probably girls if you wear like pump shoes without socks. I've fallen victim to this before. It can give you athlete's foot because it's just prime growing area. Pathogens, so Protoctista is the next one. This is the same as a protist that you might have called it at GCSE. I'm not fussed at this level which word you use, they're the same thing. They have their own kingdom. They feed on the contents of cells, so they enter your cell and eat what's inside of it essentially. In particular, we can talk about malaria. When it's inside a red blood cell, it affects your hemoglobin. Interesting fact about malaria, and we're going to do far more about malaria in Friday's lesson, but malaria has a symbiotic relationship with the vector, that's the mosquito, so it doesn't have a positive or negative effect on the mosquito, but it benefits from it because it has to go through part of its life cycle there. When it's in your cells, it will eat your hemoglobin essentially, which is bad, and that's what kills you. Now, something I want you to research, and I'll put this on OneNote as well, is how can having sickle cell anemia stop you from getting malaria? I'm not going to say any more on that. That can just be a point of research for you. So a little bit more on malaria in particular. So the most deadly form of it is called Plasmodium falciparum, but there's actually 4 different strains, and obviously that's the weakest one. The worst one, but the weakest one won't probably kill you. For example, we had some students last year in year 13, if you remember Annie and Imo Obot. Imo used to love to say that she'd had malaria 4 times, which is genuinely true. But she had the nicer versions, luckily. Anyway, symptoms of it: fevers, sweats, headaches, feelings of fatigue, and things like that. What I'm going to do now, if you look in the book, there is a table that goes through a lot of different diseases in little bits of detail. Now, as we did the other day, because I think it worked quite well, I'm going to give everyone like one disease to research. I'll type that in on OneNote, and I want you to just research a couple of things: signs, symptoms, treatments, those kinds of things for those diseases, and then we'll accumulate them all together and kind of share our answers. I'm going to do one disease per person. So any questions, please drop me an email.